Okay, here's a thought experiment to start us off. What if the global response to recent crises, the pandemic, economic shifts, wasn't just about public health or finances?
What if it was something more deliberate?
Exactly. What if it was part of a deliberate top-down effort to, well, fundamentally remake society? And maybe the story we usually hear isn't the whole picture.
That's a provocative starting point.
It is. And today we're going to explore a book that takes a really critical look at this idea, specifically what's been called the Great Reset. We're basically trying to understand its origins, its aims, what the book sees as potential consequences.
And just to be clear, everything we're discussing is drawn directly from the arguments and perspective presented within this specific book. We're guided only by that material.
Absolutely. And, as we get into these complex ideas, remember, you can continue exploring things like this. After our chat, maybe check out Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, what's that about?
It uses AI analysis to look at fascinating books, really designed to inspire a bit more reflection and critical thinking. Kind of fits with what we're doing here.
Nice. Okay, so this Great Reset, how does the book actually frame it? It's not just a standard policy response in the book's view, right?
Not at all. The book describes it, and this is a quote, as a conceited and self-loathing Central European blitzkrieg.
Wow. Blitzkrieg, that's intense language.
It really is. And it's aimed, according to the author, squarely against Western cultural, intellectual, religious, and even moral traditions.
Okay, so where does the book trace the origins of this blitzkrieg?
It links it very strongly to the World Economic Forum, the WEF, and specifically their annual meeting in Davos.
Ah, Davos. The book even draws a parallel, I think, to Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, sort of capturing that elite, detached atmosphere it perceives.
Exactly. It uses that comparison to set a certain tone about the mindset the book believes is at play there.
And a key part of the argument, as presented in the book, is how crises themselves are viewed by the proponents of this vision.
Yes, that's crucial. The book emphasizes that crises aren't just seen as problems to be solved, but as really potent opportunities for radical change that might be difficult to push through otherwise.
The old never let a serious crisis go to waste idea.
Precisely. The author cites Rahm Emanuel's famous quote on that. From the perspective laid out in the book, a crisis can make previously unthinkable shifts seem suddenly necessary, almost inevitable.
Does the book name specific figures it associates with driving this vision?
It does. People like Klaus Schwab are obviously central in the book's analysis, but he's listed alongside others, kind of framed as part of this global network of progressive experts that the book argues is behind this agenda.
Okay, so if we unpack the book's argument further, what does it identify as the sort of foundational pillars or principles of this Great Reset idea?
The author boils it down to three main things attributed to the proponents. First, changing national laws, but doing it through an international consortium.
A consortium of...
Well, the book describes it as a mix. Corporate leaders, government officials, bureaucrats, activists, even progressive oligarchs, all working together outside traditional democratic channels.
Okay, so a shift in where laws effectively come from. What's the second principle the book highlights?
This one's about directing private money, making sure private investments advance certain shared goals, things like equality and sustainability.
Ah, so this is where ESG comes in, environmental, social, governance criteria.
Exactly. The author directly connects this principle to the push for ESG, arguing it influences investments based on factors way beyond just traditional financial returns.
Got it. And the third principle mentioned in the book?
The third is about using innovation technology for the public good. But the book definitely raises questions later about who gets to define that public good and whether this leads to genuine progress or more like state-controlled tech development.
And underlying all three, the book suggests there's an assumption.
Yeah, a core assumption, according to the author, that elected Western governments are somehow just not up to the task of solving big problems, or maybe not responsive enough to what their citizens actually want.
Okay, that gives us a pretty clear picture of the Great Reset as the book portrays it. Let's maybe shift gears now to the economic side. The book really goes after this concept of stakeholderism, right?
It does, yeah. That's a major target. The argument is that stakeholderism, especially in the way the book connects it to the Great Reset vision, fundamentally changes who companies are accountable to.
How so? What's the traditional view the book contrasts it with?
Well, traditionally, the book says companies answer primarily to their owners, the shareholders. Stakeholderism, as the book sees it, kind of waters that down. It shifts accountability to, well, vaguer interests, non-owners.
Like who?
The book calls it being accountable to someone else, or even implies it's really about answering to unelected figures, these sort of influential men behind the curtain.
Hmm. So it's not just a critique. The book is actively championing an alternative economic philosophy.
Oh, definitely. It makes a strong case for a more traditional view of capitalism. It stresses that profit isn't just about making money, it's actually a vital signal
A signal for what?
for guiding production efficiently, for incentivizing fair wages, and, crucially, profit is what allows companies to actually address social issues because they need resources to do that. Profitable companies can afford to be good citizens, basically.
And the book uses history here, right? Pulling examples from the Industrial Revolution to kind of bolster this view.
Yes, and this is where it gets into some interesting storytelling. It points to things like freedom of labor and strong property rights in Britain as being absolutely key to its economic boom, contrasting that with places that had more centralized control.
I remember a bit about banking, too.
Yeah, that was fascinating. It talks about these local, small-scale country banks that financed early industry. The point the book makes is that these banks popped up organically, responding directly to local market needs for trade and new inventions.
Not directed from the top down or based on like fashionable ideas like ESG today.
Exactly. It was bottom-up, market-driven. And the book uses this to argue that diversity and experimentation, driven by the market, are how we find out what really works.
Which is contrasted
With governments trying to pick winners or impose specific technologies from above. The author mentions things like government-funded hovertrain projects that, burned through cash but didn't go anywhere.
Right. And this connects to the idea of Luddism, too, doesn't it? Resisting new tech.
Yeah, the book sees overcoming historical Luddism, the backlash against machines, as essential for progress. But then it introduces this idea of government Luddism today.
Meaning?
The example used is the German steel industry struggling, which the book links to problems caused by government mandates forcing reliance on, say, wind and solar power, arguing it creates unreliability. This kind of state-imposed tech path, the book argues, acts like a modern Luddism, actually holding back progress.
Okay, so from economics, let's pivot to the political critiques in the book. There's a big focus on sovereignty, right?
A huge focus. A central argument is that the Great Reset, as the book interprets its goals, aims to shift power away from individual nations towards some form of world government.
And the book warns this could lead to, well, it mentions concerns about rising Chinese influence.
It does. It raises the prospect of what it calls a potential CCP-dominated world, framing it as a possible geopolitical consequence of weakening national sovereignty in the West.
So it's really digging into that tension between loyalty to your own nation versus more universal ideals.
Right. The book suggests that pushing abstract, universal principles, even something like democracy, can sometimes end up undermining a nation's ability to govern itself or pursue its own specific interests. It argues that a nation active in its own interest shouldn't automatically be seen as illegitimate.
And it actually frames things like national loyalty, even concepts like America First, connecting it way back to George Washington as positive historical principles.
Yes, that's a key part of its political argument. It suggests these traditional ideas of national identity and putting your own country first are now kind of looked down upon by certain elite groups.
And it uses examples to illustrate that perceived disdain.
It points to comments like Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables, reference as evidence of this perceived contempt for ordinary people and their sense of national belonging.
This critique extends beyond national governments too, right? Towards transnational bodies.
Definitely. The European Union comes in for a specific criticism in the book. It describes the EU structure, particularly the appointed commissioners meeting in secret and being hard for voters to remove, as fundamentally undemocratic.
And this all feeds into a larger idea. The book discusses the administrative state.
Exactly. Drawing on thinkers like James Burnham, the book argues that real decision-making power is increasingly shifting away from elected bodies like Congress or Parliament and into these unelected government agencies and bureaus.
So the agencies that make the detailed rules and regulations.
Right. The book contends these administrative bodies gain immense power to issue decrees and enforce rules, effectively sidestepping the normal legislative process and even judicial review sometimes.
Why does the book think this shift is happening?
It suggests part of the motivation is a basic distrust of regular voters. It even quotes Woodrow Wilson saying something like, "The bulk of mankind is rigidly unphilosophical, and nowadays the bulk of mankind votes." The implication being that experts need to take over.
So the book sees the administrative state as elites consolidating power, believing ordinary people can't handle governance.
That's the interpretation presented, yes. A system growing less accountable, justified by the complexity of modern problems, but ultimately serving the interests of those within that system.
Okay, let's turn now to how the book discusses science, experts, and this thing it calls the crisis.
Yeah, this is another major strand.
Sure.
The book is really critical of what it sees as science becoming politicized or used as an ideology. And it focuses on the trend of experts demanding or being given huge amounts of unelected power.
It brings in Hayek here, doesn't it, from the road to serfdom?
It does. Hayek's warning that central planners, because they have to impose one-size-fits-all rules, inevitably have to become ruthless and unscrupulous to enforce them, and that these kinds of systems tend to promote the worst kind of people to the top positions.
And the book uses the COVID period as a sort of case study for these ideas.
Yes, quite extensively. It critiques the accuracy of some prominent epidemiological models, mentioning Professor Ferguson by name. It also raises questions about public health decisions, suggesting priorities sometimes shifted towards gaining attention or funding rather than the most cost-effective strategies, using an example related to early AIDS funding allocation.
What about the debate aspect? Does the book claim scientific discussion was suppressed?
It presents several instances it interprets that way. It talks about the experiences of Dr. Scott Atlas on the White House task force, how studies questioning lockdowns by researchers like Ioannidis were treated, the pushback against Dr. Martin Kulldorff and the Great Barrington Declaration, and even describes a retraction incident in Scientific American as being like a Maoist struggle session because of the pressure involved.
So the book isn't seeing these as just isolated disagreements, but maybe part of a bigger pattern.
That's the implication. It introduces this term, the crisis.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It's described as this kind of self-perpetuating cycle, a codependency involving politicians, technocrats, activists, and journalists, where there's almost an incentive to constantly generate alarm and exploit crises, real or maybe even hyped up, to advance specific agendas or consolidate power.
And how does the book contrast this with what it considers, real science?
It argues for a view of science as being inherently tentative, experimental, primarily about describing how the world is, not prescribing how society must be run. There's a strong argument that specialists, because their focus is narrow, simply don't have the broad view needed to make societal decisions.
And that giving them too much power can be dangerous.
Potentially causing vast damage, is the phrase used, because they lack that wider perspective.
There's also a point about the limits of science itself, right?
A really fundamental point.
Hmm?
The book argues science is essentially silent on intrinsic values. It can tell you how to build a toaster or how to build an electric chair, but it can't tell you which one you should build or why.
Those moral choices have to come from somewhere else.
Exactly. From politics, philosophy, religion, ideology, whatever informs our values. Science is a tool, a powerful one. But the book insists it's not a moral compass or a guide for how society should be structured.
Okay, let's shift to the cultural critiques in the book. Education and art seem to be big areas here.
They are. The author sees problems in education as reflecting deeper civilizational ones. It presents a view of declining standards over the past century, even comparing old exam questions to current literacy rates.
And it talks about an edu class.
Yeah, this idea of an educational establishment that, in the book's view, uses education more as a political tool than for genuine learning.
And within academia, it criticizes social constructivism.
Very strongly. The book argues that within this framework, the very idea of objectivity has become a term of abuse. History, it contends, gets twisted into a political weapon.
Oh, so?
By imposing today's values onto the past in a simplistic way, the book argues. It criticizes judging historical figures or events like slavery or imperialism through a purely modern lens, ignoring the complexities and context of their time, often leading to quite one-sided narratives.
Okay, what about art? What's the book's take there?
Art is seen as incredibly important, a way to understand the complexities of humanity, something capable of questioning power, even religion. The book argues that truly vital art needs to challenge the status quo, the hive mind, as it calls it.
But it suggests contemporary culture often fails to do that it's become too conformist.
That's a major argument. The book contends that a lot of modern comedy and culture has become dominated by one political viewpoint, and instead of challenging elites, it tends to reflect and reinforce their views, punishing anyone who steps out of line.
Are there examples given?
It mentions a perceived shift in sitcoms, comparing something like All in the Family, which the book suggests maybe comforted liberals by making fun of their opponents, to Will and Grace, which it sees as more about promoting specific, evolving elite social agendas. There's even a story about a TV pitch at Viacom getting shot down because the executive just couldn't grasp the idea of criticizing liberal hypocrisy. It didn't compute for them.
So, what does the book hold up as a more positive role for art and culture?
It champions art that is iconoclastic art, that breaks molds and challenges power, revealing deeper human truths. It uses historical examples. Emperor Nero's supposed last words about being an artist, Monteverdi making complex characters relatable in opera, Beethoven scratching out his dedication to Napoleon, the cry of freedom in Beethoven's Fidelio.
So, art that grapples with complexity rather than pushing a simple message.
Exactly. True art, like true religion or science in the book's view, helps us wrestle with the messy, multifaceted nature of humanity and the world. It asks the hard questions, rather than just reinforcing the currently fashionable answers.
And this view of art seems to connect back to its view on education.
It does. The book presents classical education with its focus on deep knowledge, critical thinking, and understanding the roots of Western civilization as the positive alternative to the trends it critiques. It points to classical or Christian schools, suggesting they achieve better results by sticking to these foundational principles, rather than treating education as a political project by the edu class.
Okay, so we've covered the book's definition of the Great Reset and its critiques across economics, politics, science, and culture. What's the overall takeaway, the main warning the book wants to leave the reader with?
The core message seems to be that the COVID era shouldn't be seen as this golden opportunity for a great reset, but rather as a stark warning. A warning about the dangers of too much centralized control and about abandoning principles the book sees as vital for freedom and prosperity.
Principles
Like national sovereignty, free markets operating on price signals, and intellectual freedom, the freedom to debate, question, and experiment without suppression.
And the book doesn't see this as just happening naturally, right? It sees specific actors pushing it.
Yes, it consistently frames this whole trend as a project driven by certain elite groups who, the book argues, are looking to protect and expand their own power and privilege. They might frame it as solving global problems, but the book sees it as ultimately self-serving.
Leading towards what the book calls an anti-industrial revolution, kind of rolling back progress.
That's the term used, yeah. A movement that risks undoing the gains made through individual liberty and market-driven innovation.
It definitely offers a different lens for thinking about the sheer amount of information and maybe the distrust many people feel towards institutions today. It challenges you to look deeper.
It absolutely does. It encourages you, the listener, to look past the surface narratives and consider the underlying philosophies and power dynamics the book believes are really shaping events.
So this exploration has given us a look at these proposed global changes, but through the very specific critical perspective offered in the book against the Great Reset.
And if digging into these ideas, questioning assumptions, is something that resonates with you, and you're looking for more critical analysis, remember you can check out Mindful Moments and our other podcasts. They offer more AI-driven book analyses and discussions really designed to get you thinking.
It leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? If the book is right, that true understanding needs us to constantly question and resist easy answers, how do we actually do that? How do we cultivate that critical thinking when so much around us, technology, media, social pressures, seems to push towards conformity?
That is definitely a question worth pondering long after this conversation ends.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us for this exploration. We really hope you'll subscribe and maybe share this discussion with others who appreciate critical thinking. If you're interested in reading the book itself and exploring these ideas further, you'll find a link to purchase it in the description. Until next time, keep thinking critically.